Hello, this is the mortem presentation for Back5 Playtesting Escape. For our game selection, we picked Escape, our Unit 3 game that was designed with MDA for playtesting. It is a platformer game where the main challenge was the aesthetics. In Escape, the objective is to reach the safe house before the red wall of death catches the player. There are 6 levels in the game, and the difficulty increases each level. Jumps becomes harder, or the speed of the wall becomes faster. There are a couple mechanics throughout the game. Mechanics such as enemies, spikes, jetpacks, springs, and the safe house. So for our reasoning, we chose our Unit 3 game out of the 3 games we made so far because we felt Escape was the best fit to do the playtesting. Also, the mechanics and dynamics contributing to the challenge aesthetics are straightforward. There were some issues with our Unit 1 game, which were not fixable because of the game engine. We had some issues with inconsistent ball collision. Unit 2 was designed with a goal of bad onboarding experience, and that would require a lot of work to fix those. So we felt Unit 3 was the most polished game and was also easy to work on.
Okay, and next is the playtesting plan creation process. So coming out of Unit 3, we suspected that our game had some issues. And our primary concern was whether the difficulty of the levels or the overall game had a consistent progression. We were thinking about this towards the end of Unit 3 before we even got to this unit. So it made sense to focus on that for this unit. And at the start of the unit, we brainstormed some initial ideas about how we could test the progression. And, once we knew we wanted to focus on the difficulty progression, we then looked at what we learned from this unit and took some key ideas that we thought would be applicable. Really, the whole unit was used because we just learned about playtesting in general, but there were some very specific things we took. And that'll be on the next slide. Okay, so playtesting plan creation process part 2. Like I said in the previous slide, we used multiple sources from this unit while designing our playtesting plan. After the initial idea, we integrated multiple ideas from the readings of Unit 4. So it wasn't, immediately, but after we had our initial idea, it made sense to start picking and choosing things from Unit 4. So we identified 3 things. Pair testing from the Miss Creator presentation. Write testing, that's also from the Miss Creator, or I guess that's where we saw it. But later, it got the name of it got the name right from Microsoft, like they formalized it. And then interview questions from the definitive guide to playtest questions. So we got a lot of general questions from there that we thought would be helpful. We refined our overall plan by discussing it with each other and with Dr. Z. Once we felt like the plan was solid, we went ahead and conducted our playtest session.
Since the core aesthetic of our game is challenge, we thought that our playtest should answer the question of whether our game's overall balance or progression of difficulty was appropriate. So the difficulty of the game comes from a few mechanics, The most important ones are level design, or how the levels are laid out. So that's like platform spacing, elevation differences, platform widths, etc. And then the speed of the wall, which creates time pressure for the player. And finally, the interactive mechanics of the game, like the jetpack, enemies, and spikes, all contribute to the difficulty. By looking at how the player interacted with those elements of the game, we felt that we could determine whether a level was too difficult and tweak it if necessary. Our methods were inspired by some of the readings and were pretty straightforward. Gameplay and facial reactions were recorded for each player, and this let us connect when the player looked or sounded upset to a specific level, platforming segment, or mechanic. If the player somehow indicated frustration, we could check to see if that lined up to a difficult part of the game and modify that part of the game if necessary, which lines up with our goals pretty clearly. And this kind of ties into the previous method, but we also had two players playing right next to each other, and we sort of thought that they'd feel more comfortable talking to each other or venting frustrations if they died at some part of the level or to some specific mechanic. And this just increased the amount of verbal data that we had to work with for when we were connecting the verbal data to a specific gameplay moment. And then we also took notes about anything we saw which was relevant to game balance during the playtest. For example, we marked down when players died or when they struggled with some part of the level. And yeah, we referenced that when modifying game balance as well. And we interviewed players using questions inspired by the readings in class, which gave insight into the how the players perceived the difficulty of levels and some of the game mechanics, which also contributed to how we changed them. And finally, we used the right method to modify certain balance-related parts of the game after a pair completed the playtest. So we believe that the playtest went well overall, but there were a few changes we could make going forward to get even better results in any games we make. So the non-rapid changes we tried to do took up a lot more time than we expected. So in the future, we could maybe have a kind of buffer to make any changes that we're not expecting, which would allow us to keep our playtesting session kind of going without changing anything on the fly. And we also found that the face cam was not particularly useful because of the masks. We couldn't really see like a good chunk of the player's face, so we should take that into the consideration if we're doing any playtests on campus or in person. Yeah. And the interview questions which we were asked should be asked in a more consistent manner, and we should definitely record the specific question and response in the future instead of just relying on notes. And we should have a more concrete script for the interview questions.
So let's take a look at just what our actual playtest findings were, and to do that I'm going to show you here an example of one of the notes pages from our playtesting session. This is the notes that we took from one particular playtest and a summary of how that note-taking process worked and helped us to identify what changes were needed. For the note-taking itself, we essentially wrote down anything that seemed important as it happened, so when we went back over the data we already had a solid outline to base our evaluation on. As you can see, in this particular test, we wrote down some issues they had with the menu system, the comparative lack of issues with the main controls, which levels they had finished, where they died, and to what, and anything that provoked an emotional or verbal response from the playtester. So, how they got frustrated from the constant restarting after dying in similar spots repeatedly. These kind of notes formed the basis for the changes that we made going further, and similar notes were taken for every single playtest that we did. After we finished our testing, we compared the notes and recordings of all the playtesters to try and identify which experiences were common and which were outliers. There were some areas where only one or two of our playtesters struggled, and others that were more widespread. For example, literally every person we tested with found the character select screen was unintuitive. This was a bit surprising to us, as that was actually not one of our original playtest goals, and so it was not something we really expected to come up in the testing. But as all of our playtesters encountered this issue, we walked away from the playtesting session knowing that it was something that needed to be resolved, and something that we have resolved. Only one of our playtesters made it past level 3 during the test, and that was actually due to a bug we encountered in the build where we were testing him with, which necessitated we actually skip him entirely past levels 3 and 4, straight to level 5, rather than them actually figuring something out that the other playtesters hadn't. We had gone into this playtest expecting to focus pretty heavily on level design and difficulty curve tweaks, so as level design was one of our initial playtesting goals, we heavily referenced both the notes on where and how playtesters died, as well as the actual video recordings of their test sessions to identify which areas of the level design were working as intended and which were most in need of improvement. A few of our playtesters had issues with the enemies and spike traps. One playtester in particular was killed by the same enemy 7 times, and spike traps in that same level 3 times. These were another area we had expected to need some work, which is why we tried to note down whenever a playtester died to either of those mechanics, and in several of our post-game interviews we asked the playtesters about those mechanics specifically. Many playtesters found the enemies and how to combat them unintuitive. At least one playtester tried to avoid fighting them at all, while another repeatedly died while trying to defeat a single enemy. This suggested to us that the combat mechanics were not being clearly communicated, and that the interactions between the player and enemy objects needed some reworking. Due to that previously mentioned glitch and the difficulty in our levels, not all of our players actually got much experience with the jump pack mechanic, but those who did found it difficult to control and were confused that it ran out of fuel without a clear indicator. It was not at this time communicated that the jetpack had a limited amount of fuel at all. As the jetpack, and more broadly speaking, movement in general, were a focus point in our playtesting goals, we asked the players who had the worst time with the jetpack how they felt about using the jetpack to collect more information about why they felt it wasn't working. So, finally, after we identified the issues our playtesters had, we started making revisions to resolve those issues. First and foremost, we knew we had to rework that character selection screen. In the build we playtested, the character selection screen had pictures of 3 characters in the center of the screen, each one labeled character 1, 2, 3, but then to actually select the character you needed to click on a separate set of buttons at the top of the screen that corresponded to those characters. Most of the playtesters attempted to click either the character graphics themselves or the labels that were attached to them rather than the actual buttons on the top, and we had to explain to them, no, you actually hit this. This was really easy to fix. We removed the labels and we converted the buttons into transparent boxes that surround the character sprites, so clicking the character sprite constitutes selecting the character now. It is very intuitive, very straightforward, and that issue will not be arising again. Level design was another perennial problem, as all of our playtesters found level 3 impossible to complete, so we knew the difficulty needed some changes. The most substantial change we made was we actually swapped levels 3 and 4 completely, so the level that came 4th in the build we tested is now the 3rd level in the final build, and vice versa. A few more fine changes were also made to the levels. We adjusted the positions of platforms and obstacles to generally reduce the amount of leaps of faith and provide more clearly telegraphed paths for the player to follow, as another thing that was noted was that it was not entirely clear all the time where they needed to be going, other than just away from the death wall. Changes made to the enemies and spikes were both very simple adjustments, but ones that made them substantially easier and more intuitive to deal with. In the build that was tested, the only way for the player character to defeat an enemy was to collide with them while the player character was moving downward, meaning that if an enemy hit a player character from below while the player character was either stationary or moving upward, the player character would die, even though technically speaking the enemy was below them, which a lot of players assumed would mean that the enemy would die instead. This produced significant frustration in our playtesters, who also noted that the enemies could jump very high and moved way too fast for them to actually be able to dodge. So to remedy this, the enemy jumping collision was reworked. So now the enemy will be killed instead of the player character whenever the player character's origin point is at least 17 pixels above the enemy's origin point, meaning that the player character will always kill the enemy if they're above them. The enemy jump force was also reduced, which dropped their jumping height and the speed at which they moved, resulting in them being far less likely to catch the player where they couldn't escape. The spikes were an even simpler issue to resolve. The players who had difficulty with them noted that the hitbox for spikes just seemed too large relative to the spike graphic, so all we really had to do to fix that was to reduce the size of the spike hitbox to ensure that the player character is only killed by spikes when they make a solid collision against them. Finally, for the jetpack. First of all, the jetpack was the source of the only crash we encountered in our playtesting. That particular glitch was the result of a typo in one of our local copies of the game, so it was easy to fix and it didn't have any consequences on the rest of the playtesting aside from skewing that one particular playtest's data. More significantly, though, the functional mechanics of the jetpack did receive quite a few tweaks. Players noted that the jetpack's force and the way it interacted with the existing jump physics were difficult to control. The amount of force it provided was adjusted, and we added a fuel gauge. So as soon as the player picked up the jetpack, it became apparent that this is a limited use item, and as they used it, they were able to monitor how much they had used and how much of it they could still use. The jetpack was also improved just through a general adjustment to the game's dynamics, as in addition to tweaking the jetpack itself, we made some adjustment to player character movement and gravity in general, which made them easier to control with or without the jetpack. And levels 3 and 4 were now swapped, so that the level that now comes third in the final build offers a far clearer and lower stakes introduction of the jetpack, which helps the player get the feel for it better than they could in the level that was third in the test build. In the test build, the level that is third has the jetpack appear very late in the level and has you navigate essentially a Flappy Bird style spike trap. The level that is third in the final has you essentially just use the jetpack to make a very long jump.